The year was 1887. The wind sweeping across the Wyoming plains didn't smell like spring. It smelled like loneliness. Jonas Reich was out mending a fence he'd already fixed 3 times. It wasn't about the fence. It was about making noise. Any noise to fill the silence that had swallowed his life whole 2 years ago, the day he buried his wife. The folks in town said he was the kind of man who'd rather talk to his horse than to a person. They weren't wrong. Words die in your throat after you've buried forever. So he kept to himself, with his cattle, his chores, and a grief so heavy it felt like a second shadow. Then he saw the dust on the horizon, not wind dust. This was the heavy, tired dust kicked up by footsteps. He straightened up, his hand resting near his belt, and just waited. A few minutes later, he heard it. A knock on his door. It was a sound that didn't belong out here, faint and desperate, like a trapped bird beating its wings against glass. He pulled the heavy door open, and the world seemed to stop. A woman stood there, thin, shaking, her dress torn. She was holding a little girl, maybe 3 years old, and 2 others were clinging to her skirt. All of them were pale, their faces streaked with the dirt of the road. Her eyes wouldn't meet his. "They beat me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm hurt. But I can still cook. I can work. I'll work for free forever, just so my girls can eat." Jonas didn't move. He just looked. He saw the bruise on her lip, the terror in her eyes, and the way her hands trembled as she held her children close. There was no lie there, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Without a word, he stepped aside. She hesitated for a moment, as if she couldn't believe it. Then she crossed the threshold into his quiet, empty home. The floorboards groaned under her bare feet. He pointed to the table. She sat, wincing in pain. He poured 3 cups of milk, cut thick slices of bread, and pushed them toward the children. The oldest girl, Eliza, looked at her mother for permission. The woman nodded, and the girls ate like they were afraid the food would disappear. They ate in complete silence. Jonas leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, just watching. The firelight danced across the hard lines of his face, a face carved by loss. The woman finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "We were at the Hendry farm, my husband's brother. He said I owed him. When I couldn't pay." Her voice broke. "He threw us out." Jonas stared into the fire. The wood popped and hissed. "You can rest here a while," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "No one will bother you here." Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. Her name was Millie, but he didn't know that yet. To him, she was just a ghost, blown in by the lonely wind. But that ghost was about to change everything. The afternoon slipped by in a haze of small sounds, spoons scraping against tin plates, the soft hum of the youngest girl, Ruthie, as she slept in her mother's lap. Jonas found himself repairing a kettle handle just to keep his hands from being idle. He found his eyes drifting toward Millie. He watched the gentle way she brushed her daughter's hair, the strength she used to hide her own pain. As evening fell, so did a soft rain, and the smell of wet earth filled the small cabin. Millie, despite her bruises, insisted on cooking him dinner. He didn't argue. He watched her move around his kitchen, slow and careful. The scent of stew filled the room, and for the first time in 2 years, the house felt less like a tomb and more like a home. He ate quietly. Each bite was a memory of another time, another woman's cooking, another life. He didn't want to think about it. Millie's eyes landed on a photograph on the mantelpiece, a woman in a simple dress, holding a newborn baby, his wife Sarah, and his son Daniel. Both gone. Millie didn't ask. She saw the grief in the room. It was an old acquaintance of hers. She understood. Later, after the girls were asleep on a makeshift bed by the fire, Millie stepped out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, and the moon washed the world in a pale, silvery light. Jonas was already there, leaning against the rail. "You shouldn't be out in the cold," he said, his voice low. "I've known colder," she replied, her voice filled with a weary strength that intrigued him. He wanted to ask her 100 questions. Who did this to you? Why did no one help? But the questions felt too heavy, too dangerous. Silence was safer. "Thank you," she whispered into the night, "for the food, for letting us stay." Jonas just shook his head. Ain't charity, it's just decent. She looked at him then, really looked at him. The lamplight from inside softened the hard edges of his face. She saw something there, buried deep beneath the grief, a flicker of kindness. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just listening to the sound of the crickets. When she turned to go back inside, he stopped her. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll take the chair." She started to argue, but the firmness in his voice left no room for it. She just nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and disappeared back into the cabin. Jonas stayed on the porch, listening to the soft breathing of the children. He wondered what the town would say. The whispers would start soon. He could already hear them. That lonely Reich, taking in a stray, must be desperate. He sighed. He'd been called worse. What he didn't know was that the whispers would be the least of his problems. The real trouble hadn't even started yet. The trouble was sleeping soundly, right inside his house. The next morning, the whispers began. Mrs. Wexler, the town's most notorious gossip, rode by on her old grey mare. She slowed down, her sharp eyes peering into the cabin window. She saw Millie hanging a dishcloth by the fire, and the sight of the children laughing was enough. By sundown, the entire town of Redemption would know that Jonas Reich had a woman in his house. When Jonas went to town for supplies, he felt their eyes on him. The store clerk held his gaze for a moment too long. A man sitting by the stove muttered something foul under his breath. Jonas ignored it all, but he could feel their judgment like a physical weight on his shoulders. He bought flour, beans, and a small piece of hard candy for each of the girls. As he was leaving, Deputy Cole stopped him. "Jonas," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard you got some visitors." "They needed a place to stay," Jonas said flatly. The deputy chewed on a piece of straw. "Folks are talking, saying she's trouble. Ran out on her husband's family over at the Hendry place. Her story is her own," Jonas said, turning to leave. "Just be careful, Jonas," the deputy called after him. "Sometimes trouble follows people." Jonas rode home, the deputy's words echoing in his mind. He found Millie in the garden, trying to coax some life out of the dry, neglected soil. She'd found some old seed packets in a drawer. "I thought maybe some herbs," she said, not looking at him, "to make the food taste better." He just grunted in response and went to the barn. But he watched her from the shadows. He watched her work, her movements graceful despite her injuries. He watched her with the children, her voice a soft, soothing melody. The cabin started to feel different. It smelled of baking bread and fresh herbs. It was filled with the sound of children's laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in years. It was unnerving. This peace felt fragile, borrowed. One night after the children were asleep, they sat by the fire. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with unspoken things. "The photograph," Millie said suddenly, her voice quiet. "On the mantel." "Your wife?" Jonas tensed. He didn't like talking about Sarah. "Yes." "She's beautiful," Millie said. "The baby, too." "They died," Jonas said, his voice flat, hoping to end the conversation. "In a fire. 2 years ago." He expected her to offer condolences, to say she was sorry, but she didn't. She just stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. Then she asked a question that sent a chill down his spine. "Was it a bad fire? Did they find—" She hesitated. "Did they find both of them?" Jonas turned to look at her. The firelight flickered in her eyes, and for a second he saw something there he didn't recognize. It wasn't pity, it was something else, something closer to fear. "They found what was left," he said, his voice cold. Why would she ask that? What a strange, morbid question. For the first time, a seed of doubt was planted in his mind. This woman, this victim, had a story. But he was starting to wonder if it was the one she had told him. The doubt grew like a weed in the back of his mind. He started watching her more closely. He noticed little things. The way her eyes would dart toward the road whenever she heard a horse. The way she would sometimes hum a lullaby that sounded strangely familiar. A tune he hadn't heard in years. A tune his Sarah used to sing. He told himself he was being foolish, that grief was playing tricks on him. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the simple goodness she had brought back into his life. The girls were thriving. They were getting color back in their cheeks. Their laughter was genuine now, not the timid, fearful sound it had been when they first arrived. He even found himself smiling sometimes, a strange, rusty feeling in his chest. He repaired a broken chair so the girls could all sit at the table together. He carved a small wooden horse for Ruthie, the youngest. Millie would watch him, a small, sad smile on her face. Their lives fell into a quiet rhythm. A fragile domesticity bloomed in the lonely cabin. But the peace was a lie, and it was about to be shattered. It happened one late afternoon. Jonas was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort to him. He saw a rider on the ridge, silhouetted against the setting sun. The man was big, thick-shouldered, and he rode with an arrogant slump that set Jonas on edge. As the rider got closer, Jonas saw the ugly red scar that sliced across his jaw. He didn't need to be told who it was. This had to be Henry Blood, the brother-in-law from the Hendry farm. Millie was hanging laundry on the line. She saw the rider and froze. The wet sheets slipped from her fingers and fell to the dirt. Her face went ashen. "Girls," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Go inside, now." Eliza, the oldest, grabbed her sister's hands and pulled them toward the cabin, their eyes wide with fear. Jonas set the axe down, slowly, deliberately. He walked to the front of the house and stood there, waiting. Henry Blood dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust. "I've come for what's mine," he snarled, his eyes fixed on the cabin door where Millie was hiding. "That woman belongs to me. She's my brother's widow." Jonas stood his ground. "She's under my protection." Henry laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Protection? You think you can protect her from me? She's a thief. She ran off with something that belongs to my family, a family heirloom." This was new. Millie had said he threw her out because she couldn't pay a debt. She'd never mentioned stealing anything. "What did she steal?" Jonas asked, his voice steady. "A locket," Henry sneered. "Gold. Belonged to my mother. It's got sentimental value, and I want it back, along with her." Jonas looked from Henry's cruel face to the cabin door. Millie was a thief. It didn't seem possible. But then he remembered her strange questions, the fear in her eyes. "She says you beat her," Jonas said. "She probably deserved it," Henry growled. "Now, are you going to step aside, or do I have to move you?" Jonas didn't move. He just stood there, a silent, immovable wall. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Henry's eyes narrowed. He looked Jonas up and down, taking in his size, the quiet strength in his stance. For a long moment, the two men were locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Henry cursed under his breath. "This ain't over," he spat. "That woman is a liar and a thief. You'll find out soon enough, and when you do, I'll be back." He swung himself back onto his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and unanswered questions in his wake. Jonas turned and looked at the cabin. Millie was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of terror. But was it terror of Henry? Or was it terror that her lies were about to be exposed? The air grew thick with suspicion. After Henry left, an invisible wall went up between Jonas and Millie. The easy silence they had found was replaced by a tense, heavy quiet. Millie was jumpy, her eyes constantly flitting towards the door. She tried to act normal, cooking and cleaning, tending to the children, but the fear was a palpable thing, a third person in the room with them. Jonas found he couldn't look at her without seeing Henry's sneering face, without hearing his words. "That woman is a liar and a thief." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe the bruised, desperate woman who had shown up on his doorstep. But the doubt was a poison, seeping into his thoughts. That night, He confronted her. The children were asleep. The only sound, the crackling of the fire. "He said you stole something," Jonas said, his voice flat. "A locket." Millie flinched as if he'd struck her. "He's lying," she whispered, her eyes wide and pleading. "He's a cruel, evil man. He just wants an excuse to drag me back there. Why didn't you tell me he thought you'd stolen something? I was scared. I didn't think you'd let her stay if you thought I was a thief." Her voice broke, and tears streamed down her face. "Please, Jonas, you have to believe me." He looked at her, at the genuine terror in her eyes, and a part of him wanted to. But another part, the cold, grieving part that had learned to trust no one, held back. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked out onto the porch, leaving her sobbing by the fire. He stayed out there for hours, staring into the dark, the conflict tearing him apart. The next day, he had to go into town for grain. He left Millie and the girls at the ranch, a feeling of unease settling in his gut. The whole ride in, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. In town, things were different. The usual whispers and sideways glances were replaced by an open hostility. Men who used to nod at him now turned their backs. Mrs. Wexler saw him coming and hurried across the street to avoid him. It was clear Henry Blood had been spreading his story. In the general store, the clerk served him in stony silence. As Jonas was about to leave, Deputy Cole came in. "Jonas," he said, his voice low, "I need a word." They stepped outside. "Henry Blood was in my office this morning," the deputy said. "Filed a formal complaint. Said his sister-in-law stole a valuable family heirloom. He wants me to go out to your place and retrieve it." Jonas's blood ran cold. "And are you going to?" The deputy sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Jonas, the law is the law. If he's got a claim, I have to investigate. I'm just giving you a heads up. It would be a lot easier for everyone if you just gave him back the locket." "She says she doesn't have it," Jonas said, his jaw tight. "Well, you'd better hope she's telling the truth," the deputy said, his eyes hard. "Because Henry's not the kind of man who lets things go, and he's got friends in this town." The ride home was a blur. Jonas's mind was racing. Was she lying? Had she brought this trouble down on him, on his home? When he got back to the ranch, the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. He walked in and found Millie sitting at the table, her head in her hands. The girls were huddled in a corner, their eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Jonas demanded. "He came back," Millie whispered, her voice shaking. "Henry, while you were gone, he tore the place apart looking for it. He scared the girls." Jonas looked around. Drawers were pulled out, their contents spilled on the floor. The bedding was ripped from the beds, a wave of fury washed over him. He stormed over to Millie. "Did he find it?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Find what?" she cried. "The locket. Did he find it?" "I told you I don't have it," she sobbed. "I don't have it." But something in her eyes, a flicker of desperation, told him she was lying. Later that day, while Millie was outside with the children, he did something he never thought he would do. He searched her things. He went through the small canvas bag she had arrived with, his hands shaking with a mixture of guilt and grim determination. At the very bottom, wrapped in a small piece of cloth, his fingers closed around something hard and cold. It was a locket, gold with intricate carvings on the front. He stood there for a long moment, the locket heavy in his hand, the weight of her betrayal crushing him. Henry was right. She was a liar. He felt a bitter, cold anger rise in him. He had taken her in, protected her, and she had repaid him with deceit. He was about to storm outside and confront her, to throw her and her children out into the dirt where he'd found them. But something stopped him. With a trembling thumb, he pressed the clasp. The locket sprang open, and his world fell apart for the second time. It wasn't a picture of Henry Blood's mother inside. It was a tiny, faded photograph of his wife, his Sarah. His breath hitched in his chest. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the locket clutched in his hand, his mind reeling. Sarah. How? Why? The room started to spin. It made no sense. This locket, this woman, this lie. It was all connected to his past, to the fire, to the worst day of his life. He felt like he was drowning. He had to know the truth. He stormed out of the cabin, the locket burning a hole in his palm. Millie was by the creek, watching the girls splash in the shallow water. She saw the look on his face and her smile faltered. She knew. "Jonas?" she said, her voice trembling. He didn't say a word. He just walked up to her and held out his hand, opening his palm to reveal the locket. The color drained from her face. She looked like she was going to faint. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "And why is my wife's picture in it?" Tears streamed down her face. "Jonas, I can explain." "Explain!" he roared, his control finally snapping. "Explain how you've been living in my house, eating my food, under the picture of the very woman you stole from. Explain the lies." The children started to cry, frightened by his anger. Eliza ran to her mother, wrapping her arms around her legs. "It's not what you think," Millie sobbed, her body shaking. "Then what is it?" he yelled. Tell me the truth, for once in your miserable life." Millie looked at him, her eyes filled with a pain so deep it stole his breath away. Sarah was my sister," she whispered. The words hit him like a physical blow. Sister? Sarah had a sister, he knew that. A younger sister who lived far away, who she hadn't seen in years. He'd never met her. "My name is Millie Gracewood," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Sarah was my older sister." He stared at her, his mind struggling to process this revelation. It couldn't be true. It was another lie, another trick. "You're lying," he whispered. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not. Not about this." She reached into her dress and pulled out a tattered, folded piece of paper. It was a letter. The handwriting was faded, but he recognized it instantly. It was Sarah's. His hands trembled as he took it from her. The letter was dated a week before the fire. It was addressed to Millie. In it, Sarah wrote about her life with Jonas, about how happy she was. She wrote about her baby boy, Daniel, and she mentioned the locket, a gift from their grandmother, one that she would pass on to her own child one day. It was real. This was all real. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because I was afraid," she cried, "and because of her." She pointed to the youngest girl, Ruthie, who was hiding behind her skirts, her thumb in her mouth. "Ruthie is not my daughter, Jonas. She's yours." The world tilted on its axis. He looked at the little girl, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. He saw Sarah. He saw himself. But it was impossible. His child died in the fire. He'd buried an empty coffin. "Daniel, my son." "He died," he stammered. "No," Millie said, her voice soft but firm. "His name isn't Daniel, it's Ruth. You called him Daniel, but Sarah, she called her Ruthie. She didn't want to tell you until you were used to the idea of a girl. She was your daughter, Jonas." He couldn't breathe. His daughter, alive, all this time. "The fire," he choked out. "How?" "I was there that day," Millie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'd come to visit, to surprise Sarah. We were in the house when it started. It happened so fast. There was smoke everywhere. Sarah. She pushed the baby into my arms and told me to run. She went back. She went back for you, Jonas. You were in the barn. She never made it out." She was sobbing openly now, the story pouring out of her. "I got out with the baby. By the time I turned around, the whole house was in flames. I screamed and screamed, but no one came. I thought you were dead too. So you just ran? He asked, the accusation thick in his voice. My husband found me, she said, her voice filled with shame. Amos, he was a cruel man, Jonas. When he found out who the baby was, who her father was, he saw an opportunity. He said we would raise her as our own, and one day we would come back and claim her inheritance from your ranch. He forbid me from ever contacting you. He said you'd think I set the fire myself. He kept me prisoner, Jonas, for 2 years. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more horrific than he could have ever imagined. Henry Blood. Henry is Amos's brother, Millie confirmed his unspoken question. Amos died a few months ago, an accident. Henry took over. He was even worse than his brother. He wanted the locket because it was proof of who Ruthie was. He was going to use her to take everything from you. I couldn't let that happen. So I took the girls and I ran. I came here. It was the only place I could think to go. I was going to tell you, I swear I was. I was just waiting for the right time, for a time when I knew you would believe me. He looked at the little girl, his daughter, hiding behind the woman who had saved her life. He looked at Millie, her face stained with tears, her body trembling with the weight of her confession. He had called her a liar, a thief. He had been so wrong, and in his anger he had missed the miracle standing right in front of him. His child was alive. Before Jonas could even begin to process the monumental truth that had just crashed down upon him, he heard the sound of approaching horses. It wasn't just one rider this time, it was several. He looked up and saw them cresting the hill. Deputy Cole was in the lead, and right beside him, a triumphant sneer on his face, was Henry Blood. They weren't alone. They had 3 other men with them, all armed, a posse. His heart sank. He had been so blind. Cole hadn't been warning him as a friend. He had been sizing him up. He was in on it. Millie, Jonas said, his voice low and urgent, take the girls, get in the house, bar the door. Millie didn't hesitate. She scooped up Ruthie and herded the other 2 girls toward the cabin. Stay away from the windows, Jonas ordered. He turned to face the riders, his mind racing. He was alone, unarmed, against 5 men. But he wasn't just defending his home anymore, he was defending his daughter. Deputy Cole reined in his horse a few yards from Jonas. Jonas, he said, his voice cold and official, I have a warrant here for the arrest of one Millie Gracewood, for theft and child abduction. Abduction? Jonas scoffed. That child is mine. Henry Blood laughed. That's a good one, Reich. But everyone knows your brat died in that fire 2 years ago. This woman stole my niece and my family's locket. Now, are you going to hand them over, or do we have to come in and get them? You're not setting foot on my property, Jonas said, his body tensing, preparing for a fight he knew he couldn't win. That's where you're wrong, Cole said, dismounting. This property ain't yours anymore. Henry here has a claim. Says your wife promised the land to her family if anything happened to her. And since your only heir is dead, that makes him the rightful owner. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but with a corrupt deputy backing him up. It was a lie that could get him killed. This was their plan all along. It wasn't just about extortion. It was about taking everything. His land, his daughter, his life. The other men dismounted, spreading out, their hands on their guns. They were closing in. This is your last chance, Jonas, Cole said, drawing his pistol. Don't be a fool. Jonas looked at the men surrounding him. He looked back at the cabin, at the windows, where he knew his daughter was watching. He had lost his family once. He would not lose them again. A cold, quiet rage filled him. The grief that had weighed him down for 2 years was burning away, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. He was no longer just a lonely widower. He was a father. And these men were about to find out what happened when you tried to take a man's child. You want her? Jonas said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the yard with chilling intensity. You'll have to come through me, Henry laughed and took a step forward. With pleasure. But as he moved, Jonas exploded into action. He wasn't a gunman, but he was a rancher. He was strong, hardened by years of brutal work. He lunged forward, not at Henry, but at the man closest to him, tackling him to the ground. The man's rifle clattered on the dirt. Jonas grabbed it, rolled and came up on one knee, the weapon pointed at Deputy Cole. "Drop it!" Jonas roared. Cole froze, his eyes wide with surprise. He hadn't expected the quiet, grieving rancher to fight back. The other men hesitated, unsure of what to do. In that split second of hesitation, the cabin door flew open. Millie stood there, holding Jonas's old hunting shotgun, her face pale but resolute. "Get off his land," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Henry snarled and drew his own pistol, aiming it at Millie. "You first, witch!" But before he could fire, a shot rang out, not from Jonas's rifle or Cole's pistol. It came from the side, from the trees that bordered the ranch. One of Henry's men cried out and clutched his shoulder, dropping his gun. Everyone froze, looking around wildly. Another shot kicked up dirt at Henry's feet. "Drop your weapons!" a voice boomed from the woods. "This is a private matter, and you ain't welcome." A figure emerged from the trees. It was Old Man Hemlock, Jonas's closest neighbor, a cantankerous hermit who lived 5 miles down the creek. He held a long rifle, and his aim was steady. He wasn't alone. Behind him were 2 more ranchers from the valley, men who had known Jonas his whole life, men who had watched him waste away with grief and had finally seen a spark of life return to him. The town might have turned against him, but his neighbors hadn't. Deputy Cole saw the tables turning. His authority meant nothing out here. He slowly lowered his pistol. "Now let's all just calm down," he said, trying to regain control. "There's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Jonas said, his eyes still locked on Cole, "is you thinking you could walk in here and steal my daughter." He cocked the rifle. The sound was loud and final in the tense silence. The fight drained out of Henry and his men. Outnumbered and outgunned, they dropped their weapons. "You're finished, Cole," Jonas said. "You and him both." Later, after Old Man Hemlock had marched Cole and Henry's crew back to town, at the end of his rifle to await a federal marshal, the quiet returned. It was a different kind of quiet now. Not empty, but full of relief, of hope, of a future he never thought he would have. He walked back into the cabin. Millie was sitting at the table, the shotgun resting across her lap. The 3 girls huddled around her. Ruthie looked up at him, her eyes wide. He knelt in front of her, his heart aching with 2 years of lost time. "Hello, Ruthie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your papa." The little girl stared at him for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across her face. She reached out a tiny hand and touched his rough cheek. In that moment, the last of the ice around Jonas's heart melted away. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time in a very long time, he wept. Not tears of grief, but tears of a profound, impossible joy. Spring finally came to the ranch. The world woke up, painted in the vibrant colors of new life. The cabin, once a monument to grief, was now filled with the sound of a family. Laughter echoed off the walls. The smell of baking bread was a constant, comforting presence. Jonas learned the rhythms of being a father. He taught Eliza how to ride, helped the middle girl, Clara, plant her own small garden, and spent hours just holding Ruthie, making up for lost time. He and Millie found a new rhythm, too. They were 2 people scarred by the past, bound together by a shared secret and a fierce love for the children. They didn't talk much about what happened. They didn't need to. They communicated in shared glances, in quiet smiles, in the easy way they worked side by side, rebuilding their shattered lives into something new, something stronger. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the plains, they stood on the porch, watching the girls play in the yard. "I never thought love could come so quietly," Millie said, her voice soft. Jonas looked at her, at the strength and kindness in her eyes. He had opened his door to a stranger, and in doing so, he had found his way back to himself. "It's the only way it lasts," he said. He reached out and took her hand. It felt right. It felt like coming home. The world was still a hard and unforgiving place, but here, on this small patch of land, under the vast Wyoming sky, they had built a sanctuary, a place where mercy had opened the door and love had walked in. They were a strange, patched-together family, born from lies and fire and loss, but they were whole, and they were happy. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we thought we had lost forever. What do you think? Can a family born from such a tangled web of secrets and lies truly find peace? Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most broken ground. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.